Why do more people get diagnosed with autism every single year? Not a little more. A lot more. In the year 2000, researchers estimated that about 1 in 158-year-olds had autism. By 2022, that number was 1 in 31. Picture a school with 1,000 students back in 2000. 6 or 7 of those kids would likely have been identified as autistic, probably the ones whose struggles were hard to miss, sitting a little apart, needing extra help with things other kids managed on their own. That same school today, same size, same neighborhood, would have over 30. Nobody moved. Nobody built a new water tower, but the number multiplied by 5 anyway. So what changed? The children or the counting? That question is stranger than it sounds, because autism isn't diagnosed like measles. There's no blood test, no scan, no outbreak map. It's identified through observation, interviews, and clinical judgment, which means the number on that chart isn't a direct photograph of biology. It's a photograph taken by whoever happened to be holding the camera that decade. For years, the go-to explanation was simple. Something in the modern world is causing more autism. Diet, chemicals, screens, vaccines, a rumor that's been debunked so many times it really should have filed for retirement by now. It's a tidy explanation, with a villain and a timeline. The problem is that researchers went looking for that villain, study after study, and it kept failing to show up for its own trial. So try a different angle. Maybe the number climbing isn't measuring how much autism exists in the world. Maybe it's measuring how good we've gotten at noticing it. That's a comforting theory. It also isn't the whole truth. Let's follow the evidence anyway. Start with the paperwork. The word autism in the year 2000 didn't mean what it means today. Back then, the diagnosis was reserved almost entirely for children with obvious, visible struggles. Other labels sat nearby on the shelf. Asperger's syndrome, pervasive developmental disorder, each catching people the main category missed. Eventually, all of those got folded into one wider category, the autism spectrum. Same building, wider door. Comparing an old autism number to a new one means comparing who fit through a narrow door to who fits through a much wider one. Some of those people were there the whole time. They just weren't standing in the right doorway to be counted. Some of the increase also came from something researchers call diagnostic substitution. Kids who decades ago would have been labeled with an intellectual disability or a speech delay are now, more accurately, labeled autistic instead. One California study found that shifting diagnostic habits accounted for roughly a quarter of the state's increase over 13 years. Nobody appeared out of nowhere. They got moved to a more accurate filing cabinet. There's also a practical incentive at play here, and it's easy to overlook. A diagnosis can unlock therapy, school accommodations, insurance coverage, and a framework for understanding what a child actually needs. Once identification became tied to real support, families and clinicians had a much stronger reason to chase down an accurate diagnosis instead of settling for a vague description. That's not a story about families shopping around for a label. It's closer to the reverse. Most systems require the label before they'll open the supply cupboard. The growth also isn't even across the spectrum. In the early 2000s, about half of identified autistic children also had an intellectual disability. By 2016, that had dropped to roughly a third. The fastest growing group isn't the most visibly affected. It's the kids who talk fluently, do fine in school, and just seem a little intense, a little particular, a little, that's just how they are. This starts to feel less like a statistics lecture and more like a decades-long game of hide-and-seek, where nobody told half the players they were hiding. Consider adults. Diagnoses among adults have risen sharply. People getting identified for the first time at 28, 45, 67. A 67-year-old doesn't become autistic the moment a clinician writes it down. Whatever traits led to that diagnosis were there the entire time, usually filed under a different label. Difficult, odd, too sensitive, or in some households, simply Uncle Gary. The diagnosis didn't create the person. It arrived to a meeting it was 40 years late for. The demographics tell an even clearer story. The steepest recent increases haven't come from some new universal exposure hitting everyone equally, the kind of thing you'd expect to show up uniformly, like a change in the water supply. They've come disproportionately from girls and women, from young adults, and from Black, Hispanic, and Asian communities that earlier diagnostic systems consistently underserved. If a new environmental cause were behind this, you'd expect the increase to look roughly even everywhere. Instead, the fastest growing growth is happening exactly where the old detection system had its biggest blind spots. That points to a correction, not a new cause. The girls and women piece might be the strangest thread here. Autism's clinical picture was built almost entirely by studying boys, a bit like designing a smoke detector and only ever testing it in one kitchen. Girls often present differently, mimicking classmates, rehearsing social behavior, holding it together at school, and unraveling later somewhere private. That performance was good enough to fool the very system built to catch it. When researchers screen entire populations instead of relying on existing diagnoses, the ratio of boys to girls shrinks substantially. A lot of autistic women spent their lives being described as something else instead. Anxious, difficult to read, just a lot. Even geography gets in on it. In 2022, one monitoring site in Texas identified autism in about 1% of 8-year-olds. One site in California identified it in over 5%, 5 times the rate, in the same country, in the same year. Biology doesn't swing that hard over a few hundred miles of highway. Access to specialists and school evaluation systems do. A diagnosis, then, isn't only the meeting point between a person and a condition. It also depends on whether a system nearby is capable of noticing them. 2 children with nearly identical traits can land on opposite sides of the statistic simply because one grew up near better paperwork. An honest investigation resists the tidy ending here. Some studies have found that even after accounting for broader definitions and better screening, a portion of the increase remains unexplained. Autism has strong genetic roots, and researchers keep studying other possible contributors: parental age, premature birth, pregnancy complications. None of them currently offers a single dominant explanation, which is science's polite way of saying, we're still working on it. There's a mechanism that ties most of this together, and it behaves less like a light switch and more like a loop. A broader definition invites more evaluations. More evaluations reveal presentations that used to slip past everyone. Those newly counted cases sharpen research and public understanding. Better public understanding helps still more people recognize the same traits in themselves or their kids. And because a diagnosis now carries real practical value, there's more reason than ever to go looking for one. Each stage feeds the next, which is why the line on the chart can climb far faster than human biology could plausibly shift on its own. So where does that leave the original question? Autism prevalence was never a fixed number sitting under a rock, waiting to be found. It behaves more like an instrument reading, sensitive to the definition being used, the population being studied, and whether anyone was even looking in the right direction. Change the instrument, and the number moves, even if the people barely do. Which leaves one idea worth keeping. The diagnoses kept climbing largely because autism itself was never as rare as the old numbers made it look. The rare thing was being seen. Well, that's the spectrum for you. Turns out it was never hiding people, just hiding from people. So if you've got a question that's been standing quietly in the wrong doorway of your brain for years, waiting for someone to notice it, drop it in the comments and we'll go looking. And if you'd rather cry about something smaller in scope, our last video explains why onions make you cry. Because apparently your face has been staging a tiny chemical protest this whole time, and nobody bothered to ask what it was protesting.